Hi everyone, Margot here. Welcome to Joie de Livre. Well, summer's officially over, so I wanted to make this video to look back on some of the books that I enjoyed this summer and do a little recap. So let's get started. So when I was younger and in school, summer was a great time to put the textbooks away and spend some time catching up on some reading for fun. And I've always been a big reader and loved enjoying books, particularly fiction. Summer's a great time to just curl up with a book and spend a whole afternoon that way. But now that I've been working for a few years, I don't have quite as much time, but still try to take some time during the summer, whether on vacation or just on the weekends by the pool, to check out some books from the library or buy a few books on Amazon and enjoy having some time to just read for fun. So let's jump right in. I have a couple of books here that I wanted to talk about. The first one is this, My Cousin Rachel. So I've been a big fan of Daphne DuMaurier for a long time since I was younger. I always loved her novel Rebecca, and I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with that as well, and with the classic movie and the kind of the gothic love story there. But I hadn't really explored a lot of this author's other works, and my mom gave me this book as a gift. So I started it not really knowing what to expect, but within a couple pages, I was hooked. And this was one of those books that I just couldn't put down. So for those of you who have read Rebecca and are familiar with this author, it's very much kind of the same, how can I put it? It's almost like a gothic story as well. It's set in Cornwall in the 19th century, and you follow the protagonist, and his name is Philip Ashley, and essentially he has a distant cousin named Rachel who comes to visit. And throughout the whole story, it's one of those stories where you're never really sure who's telling the truth and whose version of events is accurate. And Rachel kind of comes in, and Philip is this very regimented character who has a way of life that he's very used to. He's a bachelor, he's on his own, and then Rachel comes in for a visit, which becomes an extended visit and kind of turns everything upside down. So the whole story, you're kind of wondering, even till the very end, you're wondering who's the good character here, who's moral, who is amoral, and what's going to happen. So I really enjoyed this book. I felt like the writing was very clear and very compelling, and it was just one of those that hooked me in to the very end and really left me wanting more. And the good news on that is it's been made into a film this year, and I haven't seen it yet. You can tell from the cover, it's starring Rachel Weisz, who I love Rachel Weisz. I think she's a wonderful actress and very pretty. So I'm looking forward to seeing that, hopefully this weekend. I think it's just now out on iTunes, so I'm looking forward to watching that. But I highly recommend this book. I would give it 5 stars, and I think for whatever reason, it's, at least to me, it hasn't been very well known or very well publicized. It's an older book given the time that the author lived. Looks like it was originally published in 1951. But I would definitely give this one a read if you're a fan of fiction or of gothic novels. So that was the first book that I really enjoyed this summer. And another one is this, Anthony Doerr, All the Light We Cannot See. And I know I'm a little bit late to the game on this one. I think it was published in 2015, maybe. And it did win the Pulitzer Prize, well, 2014, so I'm 3 years behind the times. But I tend to not read books right when they come out for whatever reason. I don't know, maybe I'm just a skeptic, but I like to see what press they get, and a lot of my books I get recommendations from word of mouth. But this one, I was in the airport and my flight got delayed. I was stuck in the airport for a few hours, and I just went to the bookstore and thought I'll find whatever I can find, and picked this one up. And as with the last book I discussed, My Cousin Rachel, I just got hooked on it right away. And for those of you who aren't familiar with this book, it's set in World War II in Europe, and it follows 2 stories. One is a young Parisian girl, Marie-Laure, and one is a young German boy named Werner and his sister. And Marie is growing up in Paris, and she develops a condition where she is blind. So it kind of starts out when she's young and goes through kind of what that experience was like for her, and how she has a wonderful, loving father who kind of helps her overcome a lot of the obstacles. And then with Werner, he's a young boy growing up in an orphanage in Germany, just kind of as Hitler's coming to power. So there's a lot of issues there as well. And one thing that was interesting about the book was that there's a lot of flashback, flash forward, flash sideways to the other characters. And I feel like sometimes in books that doesn't work, and it can be really confusing and hard to figure out what's going on. But in this one, for me, it really worked, and I felt like the author used that to good advantage and kind of gave you a good framework to work from. So, and I really liked the contrast of the two stories, and you feel like you want these characters to meet up. The whole time you're wondering about these two different stories and how they're connected, and feeling kind of hints about how the characters are going to meet up. And I won't give anything away, but that was just kind of fun to see how the author weaves those two stories together. And as far as the Werner story from his perspective, I think a lot of us look back on World War II and like to say, if I were in Germany, or if I were wherever, here's how I would have acted, and here's what I would have done. And it kind of gives you a bird's eye view into what it was really like living in those times, and being a young child growing up, and especially being an orphan and trying to make his way in the world. And I really appreciated the author's perspective into that character. And another thing I really liked about this story was I felt like the characters were very dynamic. You didn't have a lot of flat, static, stale characters. They were, evolving and growing and changing and being pushed to their limits, as you can imagine, during a war zone. And then with the story of the young girl, Marie, she ends up, this is not a spoiler, it happens, relatively early on in the book, but she ends up having to leave Paris and go to St. Malo. And I was never very familiar with St. Malo, France, but after reading the book, it kind of piqued my interest a little bit and wanting to research. And it looks like it's a beautiful little French seaside town that was just bombed terribly during the war, and it kind of made me want to visit that area of France. I think it would be very interesting, and there's a lot of history there. But with her story, just seeing how being blind in the middle of a war and not always having someone there to help her, it really was a very compelling story on her part. And seeing how the people in her town came together, and the war really showed a lot of people's true colors. I thought that aspect of it was very interesting. And then also with her, I wanted to add, there were some scenes in this book where I was literally on the edge of my seat, wondering what's going to happen, and stayed up far too late waiting to see what would happen to this character. So I felt like at a certain point in the book that I knew these characters and that she was my friend, and I wanted to know what was going to happen to her. So I highly recommend this one as well, All the Light We Cannot See. Sometimes with books that win these big prizes, I wonder if it's going to be, some highbrow piece of literature that's going to be dull or dry, and this one was not. It really held my attention, and I love books that, one of my favorite genres is historical fiction. I love books that give you a snapshot into history and a time where people were really going through these events and what they were thinking and what they were feeling. And the characters, of course, are fictional, but the situations they were in were real. And anyway, I really enjoyed this book, and I felt like the writing was excellent. There were just some pages where I thought the writing was beautiful and made me want to keep reading. And I haven't explored any other works by this author, but that's definitely on my list now because I was really impressed with him and with everything he had to say. And so the third book I have, I already returned it to the library, so I apologize I don't have that cover to show you, but it's the Guernsey Literary and Potato Peel Pie Society. And it's another book set during World War II. I didn't do that intentionally, but these books just sort of found me. And my sister had recommended this book to me years and years ago, and for whatever reason, I didn't pick it up until now, and I ended up checking it out from the library earlier this summer. And this is one of those books that was just delightful. And even though it's set during the war, I just felt like it was such an uplifting book. And it just made you feel good to read it, which every now and then it's just nice to have a book like that, when you come home from work or on the weekend, just to be able to enjoy something that makes you feel good is nice. But it was an interesting format because it was an epistolary novel, so it's told completely through letters, which I think is interesting because you're getting different points of view from each letter, whereas with a lot of books you have one point of view from one character, maybe two, or you have an omniscient narrator, but here you're getting a lot of different points of view from a lot of different characters. And as with All the Light We Cannot See, I just really fell in love with these characters, and they were so charming. Some of them were quirky, some of them were sophisticated, some of them were quiet, but they all just had an interesting point of view, interesting expressions, and I didn't know a lot of the history about the island of Guernsey, and during World War II, it was actually captured and occupied by the Nazis. And so in the book, it talks about how a lot of the inhabitants of the island, they didn't know what was going on with the war. Their food was very, very restricted. So that's where the potato peel pie and the title comes from, which I always saw that title and thought, what's that all about? But it was a real recipe that was concocted during the war when you didn't have sugar or flour or butter. They made this potato peel pie recipe, and I looked it up online, and it's a real thing, and I'm not going to make it because it doesn't sound very good. But anyway, so the book centers on the island of Guernsey and the inhabitants there, and it's actually most of the action takes place post-war, but the characters are explaining and kind of reliving a lot of events that happened during the war. And I don't want to give too much away again, but just seeing the way, as with the other books, seeing the way that people came together during the war and really banded together and fought for one another, it was just really uplifting to me. And then, like I said earlier, some of the characters, there's this one character named Isola Pribby. I hope I'm saying her name right, but she just was the type of wonderful, quirky person you would love to have in your life. She's always coming up with these different potions and decoctions and love potions and just quirky things like that. And I just found the characters to be really charming and really, really enjoyed the book for sure. And it also piqued my interest with the island of Guernsey and learning more about the history of it during the occupation in World War II and how there really were a lot of brave people and wonderful stories that came out of it. So that's all for today. Thank you for watching. I hope that you pick up these books if you haven't already, and if you read them or have read them, leave a note in the comments if you liked them or didn't like them, and if you read any other books over the summer that you want to share about, leave that in the comments too. So thanks for watching. Have a great day.